Thank you so much. We're packed house. Thank you. So Christina and I are going to talk to you a little bit about this evening about restoring some common sense to feminism. You'll very quickly pick up on the dynamic that we have together, which is something like concerned mum and runaway child. She'll occasionally throw me black looks, and I'll have to skip the joke I had planned.
Do you want to speak from the podium, dear?
Yes, I will. So I'm going to say a few things, and then Christina will, and then we'll get on to the good bit, which is the discussion. I'm going to try. How's that? Is that all right? I'm going to try reading from this. I've never done this before. It could be a disaster. You wouldn't think I was a technology journalist, would you? I don't even know how to turn them on. Look, it's gone. It's gone. There it is. All right, great. All right, thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Milo Yiannopoulos, and given our brief time together this evening, I'm going to give you the short form of my biography. I am a dangerous faggot. I am so dangerous that universities in the United Kingdom, like Manchester, Durham, and York, have banned me from speaking, lest the student body experience a collective mental breakdown at the sight of somebody who likes to spend time with gentlemen in an affectionate and intimate way. She told me I couldn't say sucks dick. But doesn't believe that the state should take 75% of my earnings and spend them on feminism, slam poetry societies and pro-Palestinian community theatre. The University of Minnesota is to be commended for hosting me, and of course the one and only Christina Hoff-Sommers, otherwise known to the world and known probably to some of you in the audience as Based Mom. Yes. So seeing Christina is going to be the highlight of my trip until I found out that you have the largest mall in America. Right here. And you also have a very large Somali population, but nobody tells me these important things before I show up. Nobody knows. They didn't even let me near the black-only dorm.
Please quiet down and allow the program to continue undisrupted. Demonstrations are authorized at plaza locations outside of the building.
We should have taken a video.
If anybody else wants to try something like that, I'd be very much obliged if they got it out of the way right now.
Anybody else who's desperate to get something out of their systems, do it now. Good or bad, I mean, I don't mind. Lovely, thank you. Oh, I had a really good finisher then as well. I'm going to have to skip to the next joke. All right, before we discuss how progressive feminism's gone off the rails, I'd like to say just a couple of brief words about my co-host, probably one of the greatest and most authentic feminists in America, Christina Hoff-Sommers. Now, you may love my stunning hair, rapier wit, charm, dazzling popularity, good looks, and of course, humility. But Christina is the real deal, and in this new emerging sort of cultural libertarian movement, there are attention-seeking hellraisers, and there are respected academics who really are very brave for standing athwart the forces of progressive history and relying on that boring old thing, facts and evidence-based opinion. And so we're very lucky to have Christina. Nobody would debate me because they knew they'd lose from this university, so we're very privileged to have Christina. So give one more round of applause for Christina. All right. Okay, now we get to the good shit. Sorry. That's what she was looking at. Little girls love imaginary animals. I know I did. But like unicorns and various other mythical creatures, women today, at least in the progressive third wave movement, have invented a new kind of fantasy. It is a conspiracy theory known as the patriarchy. It is this mystical energy that surrounds us.
Women, not women haters!
They were so much better at Rutgers.
Milo, tell them to take their coats. Say, take their coats.
Don't give them their coats. We'll send you your coats in 2 weeks. Oh, she feeds me all my best lines. That was hers. You see, she looks like an angel, but it all comes from her. All right, I'll try and get through as quickly as I can because I know the Q&A is good. Is the bit that everyone comes from. Does anyone here believe in the wage gap? Does anyone here believe that women are paid less than men for the same work? Does anyone believe that?
They aren't paid as much as men.
Somebody, okay. So we have one idiot. Any other idiots? No, good. Well, let me briefly dispel this for you, because I know that you're going to enjoy finding out that this is not a problem you have to worry about. This is based on a confusion between wages and earnings. Of course, if you add all of the money that women make and all of the money that men make, and you do a simple division, you will arrive at a figure of between 75 and 80 cents on the dollar. But that cents on the dollar is the misleading bit. It's used to suggest to people that if they do the same work, they'll be paid less. That's not, of course, what happens. That's against the law. It doesn't happen anywhere. What does happen is that women make different lifestyle choices. And, you know, Christina is the expert in talking about this, and I'm sure many of you will have seen her videos. This is one of the pervasive myths, along with campus rape culture, the idea that we somehow enable or encourage sexual assault on campus, which of course we don't. The idea is offensive and absurd. And various other progressive myths that seem to have taken root in modern feminism, and they seem to have taken root almost entirely unopposed. And this is a huge failure of the modern conservative movement, but it's sort of understandable from men's point of view, because nobody wants to be that guy. The problem is we've got to a stage where a particular brand of runaway feminism seems to have taken over the entire movement. Sensible, equity feminists who believe in equality of access and opportunity, people who believe that men and women have different but equal aptitudes, are in the minority in the modern feminist movement. They've been replaced, sad to say, by people who are very often sexist, sociopathic, mean, cruel, vicious, who've created an
Like yourself!
I don't consider it an insult. I consider it a great homosexual virtue. If I wasn't vicious, I wouldn't have a job. If anyone else is feeling triggered by the disruption at the back,
That's why I'm here. It's so safe.
make yourself.
Fuck off, Milo.
Make yourself. All right, I'm going to skip through some of the examples I had and get straight on to the end, because I know that we want to get on to the Q&A, which is what most people are interested in. I think feminism has wandered very far from its original purpose. Feminism and the struggle for women's rights is the thing that perhaps we can be most proud of, together with the civil rights struggle in the West. Rights for women, women having the vote and having equal access and opportunity, which they do have, to our educational institutions, is perhaps one of the greatest achievements of our civilization, of our society. It is not something that happens everywhere else in the world. Unfortunately, modern feminism doesn't care much about those other places in the world. It would rather police you for microaggressions or mansplaining, manspreading, manslamming, a variety of what can only be described as utter horseshit that is designed to bash men. Now, it's a weird thing that this is sort of taken hold. One thing that would be nice for you to take away from this, not only a return to sort of evidence-based opinions and to facts, which modern feminism struggles with, but also a return to a sense of reason and calm. And we've called this talk Calm Down, because it seems as though, as this movement begins to realize, in protests like these idiots, that they don't have very much to say in terms of facts. They would rather just shout and and have klaxons and all the rest of it because they can't really argue with the facts. There's a sort of increasing hysteria about ever smaller infractions. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, some truly terrible things are happening to women. And the effects of modern feminism are sort of manifold and fairly ugly wherever they appear. There are plenty of instances and plenty of respects in which young boys are really suffering. Young white boys, for instance, which you never hear about, they become demonized as the straight white male of folklore, are some of the most educationally underprivileged people in the world, in the UK particularly, and here too. Now, I'm going to save some of the other stuff for the questions because I know that you're going to have lots of things to ask me. All I would say is this: if you're a student looking to come to a university for an open and honest interrogation of the facts and the universe around you, modern feminism, progressivism, and the Black Lives Matter movement are not your friend, because these are movements that seek to close the Overton window, that seek to shut down the reasonable avenues of inquiry. These are movements that don't want you to think about the world as it really is, that describe a reality that doesn't exist. And in many cases, modern feminism has become, in my view, a nasty, bitter, sociopathic, ugly, lesbianic hate fest. I'm going to hand over now to one of these shining beacons and great symbols of hope in the feminist movement, Christina Hoff Sommers.
Okay. I have everything. Yes, thank you. Good evening. I am Christina Hoff Sommers, the factual feminist, reporting to duty. And the Minnesota Republic tried to find someone to debate Milo. They talked to people in the Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies Department, and no one came forward. So they brought me to do the job. I'm not really going to debate him. Who would? I want to do that. But I am going to try to introduce a note of moderation and calm. For example, in your conclusion, you did say something, you impugned lesbians. I don't think that was a good thing to do, Milo. Rethink it. And my best allies, I've had like a 30-year struggle against what I thought were eccentric and sometimes destructive forms of feminism. And there many brilliant women have helped me, and who happen to be lesbians. Camille Paglia, Coretta Kortka, who wrote a magnificent book called Professing Feminism with Daphne Patai, Nora Vincent, Diane Ravitch, not to mention in the 90s when we were fighting the McDworkinites, Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin, there were the lipstick lesbians who were on my side and who were fantastic. And not to be hurtful, Milo, they had better hairdos than you. So
this is why she didn't want to show me the speech before.
But it's best, so all I'm going to say, and I don't want to sound like a mom, but it's better to criticize people for what they say and what they do, not for who they are. Anyway, this brings me to the subject of tonight's talk. I'm going to discuss a group of people who say and do some exceedingly odd things. I call this group the fainting couch feminists. And I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then Milo and I will entertain questions, rebuttals, refutation. Not death threats.
They've left, actually.
Now, I use the term fainting couch to designate today's trigger warning safe space microaggression monitoring ladies. I borrow the term from those delicate ladies of the Victorian era who would retreat to an elegant chaise, and when they were overcome with feeling and emotion, in truth, they were actually probably reacting to their corsets being too tight, but that's a topic for another day. Now, where did the fainting couch feminists come from? I'm going to try to answer that question. And why are we hearing so much, why is their movement so salient today? And what can we do to get feminism, to get our universities, to rescue them from their safe spaces? I'll try to answer each question quickly and then to questions. I first encountered fainting couch feminists last spring when I gave a talk at Oberlin and Georgetown. Before I even arrived on campus at Oberlin, students started protesting my lecture. There was news spread quickly. A critic of trigger warnings is coming. She's questioned feminist statistics, feminist victim statistics. And they started posting madly on Facebook and organizing their safe spaces and all sorts of interventions. And I have been lecturing on campuses for many years. And not everyone agrees with me. They would come, we'd spar, we'd debate, that was fine. At these two colleges, they didn't come to spar and debate because they claimed I would give them PTSD. And at both, at Oberlin, they posted, you can't really see it, but a love letter to ourselves, which was heartfelt and poignant. But it has a trigger warning, don't miss that. And they posted this letter, and they referred to me, they called it her violence. I mean, that was a philosophy professor coming to argue about and defend a different style of feminism than the one they favored, and they called that violence. During my talk, there was all sorts of heckling and carrying on, and 30 women and a therapy dog fled to a safe space. And they had, I think I have a picture of this dog somewhere. There was some of this there. And by the way, on the campuses, they had festooned on the wall angry flyers, like, they would say things like, free speech doesn't mean hate speech. Go home and take your internalized misogyny with you. How could I not take it with me if it was internalized? I don't understand that. But at Oberlin, the first few rows were filled with young women with red tape on their mouths. And I don't know what it meant. And now it seems to be getting worse because at Milo's talk, they showed up with red paint or blood. I don't know what it was. Anyway, it's escalating in somehow this theme. The protesting Oberlin, Georgetown, Rutgers students, that they're not alone. At Brown University, they hosted a debate. Two feminists, a libertarian feminist, Wendy McElroy, came to debate Jessica Valenti. It was a debate. Both sides were represented. They were going to argue back and forth about the legitimacy of feminist statistics on campus sexual assault. Well, just the idea of this debate, it just panicked great numbers of students. They demanded a safe room, and with the full cooperation of the Brown president, Christina Paxson, the school provided a safe room for the triggered students. And as Judith Shulevitz in the New York Times described this room, it came equipped with cookies, coloring books, bubbles, Play-Doh, calming music, blankets, and a video of frolicking puppies. Now, I can't be, I know there are many, many feminists, including Judith Shulevitz, who just think, is this what feminism has come to? I have been a feminist since the 1970s. I believe in equality and dignity and fairness, basic liberties for all human beings. And because women are just as intelligent and rational and mentally strong as men, but this movement of fainting couch feminism, it's almost as if it reinforces the worst stereotypes about women. And by the way, I don't remember in my readings in my early days of Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, there were no frolicking puppies, to calm women down. Now you are in the presence of a safe space, fainting couch feminist, if they start demanding trigger warnings. Now, trigger warnings developed in the feminist blogosphere, and at first they were fine. They were sort of chat rooms for people who had genuine trauma. They wanted to, in the private, well, not privacy, but they wanted to reach out to one another, and they would warn that these were for people who were psychologically fragile. They came together to discuss some traumatic experiences. But they quickly moved. They didn't stay in the chat rooms for a specific group of people, what we saw very quickly was these discussions moved to newspapers, to classrooms, and suddenly professors at schools, certainly Oberlin and Rutgers and UCSB, Columbia University, they started demanding them for books, for novel. The Great Gatsby was thought to be triggering because there was some violence against women in the book. And then the fainting couches took the next step. They started to ask their universities, they started to ask their professors to, in some cases, disinvite speakers. We saw that at Oberlin, but also to take things out of their lectures. The most shocking thing that I read was in the New Yorker. It was an article by a law professor, Jenny Suk, at Harvard law professor, and she said that students now organize and come in a law course and insist that rape law not be taught, because that would be potentially a source of distress. And this is at a law school. And you're training future prosecutors. I mean, this was one of many goals of the second wave feminism, is to start to attend to problems, special problems of women that had been ignored. And of course, we wanted to study rape law and improve the laws. But now, in the name, so bizarre, but Jenny Suk, in her article in the New Yorker, she said that about feminism, these young women are asking, this is a colleague of hers, a student had asked her not to use the word violate in class, like, does this conduct violate the law? Because the word was triggering. Now, it turns out that trigger warnings themselves are triggering. Oh, I forgot to show you the Milo, those are Milo's protesters. Milo was more worried about getting that paint on his shoes, I think, than anything else. Now, so if you go to Geek Feminism Wiki, whatever that is, what is it anyway? Well, anyway, there it is. You go there, and they have a trigger warning for their entry on trigger warnings. And at a recent feminist conference in London, the attendees, and these attendees were female students, leaders from major universities across Britain, Oxford, Cambridge, brilliant young women, but it turned out that the attendees were very worried and advised those in attendance not to clap. At the conference, the organizers, they explained that clapping could be triggering. And, I think I have. And instead, they asked them to do feminist jazz hands, which, Milo, can you demonstrate?
Yes. I'll just walk you through the basics. Feminist jazz hands look a little like this. Now, if you want to add a little spice, you can turn them into feminist pizzazz hands. And these are for especially good speakers. I feel really excited about the contents of the talk. You just have to be careful not to catch people's bracelets. And then, of course, if you're very excited and you really want to express extreme pleasure, there is sizzle fingers, which some of you will know. Do you know about sizzle fingers? Yeah? And then there are various other strategies that you can... The contents of a talk. What's the last one? I forget the last one.
Oh, that's enough. That's good. Thank you.
You can use with your hands. You can do this to indicate that you're excited about...
You get the idea.
It's how to clap at a feminist conference.
Now, as an equality feminist, an emancipated woman I was a feminist starting in the 1970s, as I said. I'm just dismayed by all of this. It makes no sense. I'm not alone. There are feminists, even some that I've wrangled with. We have bonded over this. We're triggered by it. Because women, the message of feminism, women are strong. Women aren't fragile little birds who can't cope with the Great Gatsby or with criminal law classes or with clapping. Today's college women, they're not fragile children. They're strong. They're arguably empowered, perhaps the most empowered, self-determining people in human history. And yet, in their classrooms, they may learn, if they take a typical, not all, but a typical gender studies course, they will be initiated into this sort of paranoid worldview about a massive patriarchal system. I remember one colleague I had in feminist philosophy had a theory about the sex-gender system. We were all captive to the system. And as she explained it, we were all born bisexual. And then through socialization, she said, one half was, we were, through socialization, we were turned into feminine and masculine gender. One destined to command, the other to obey. I remember telling that to my husband, who said, like, which one commands, you know? But she clearly had in mind that it was the women who are submissive and so forth, and this is just simply, it's not reality. So, but let me say a word about the trigger warnings, because I am nice, and if a student came to me and was vulnerable and fragile and was going to be traumatized by something we talked about in the class, I would want that person to have help. And I think every university has to have counselors available. But what you should know is there is no basis for issuing trigger warnings. There's no science. Richard McNally is a Harvard psychologist and an expert on anxiety disorders. And he recently published a review of the relevant literature, the relevant research, and determined that if anything, trigger warnings are harmful. And for one thing, if you are a victim of PTSD, I mean, they don't know what will trigger an attack, so it's unpredictable. And secondly, what you should do is be in therapy and get a process where you get systematic exposure, not avoidance. And he also cites studies that show the danger of seeing one's life through the prism of trauma. And he warns, having trauma become central to one's identity bodes poorly for one's mental health. Now, please don't tell anyone on Tumblr that I said that, or they'll be, all night you'll be getting like, oh, I literally can't even, she said that. She questioned trauma culture. Trigger warnings, in my opinion, are not about protecting people. They're just a way to assert power and control over others, because instead of having to persuade them through evidence and argument, you shame them, intimidate them, and silence them through basically psychodrama. Now, in the past few years, fainting couchers have been triggered by things like blurred lines, that's song Blurred Lines. I thought it was a rape anthem. And even a weird statue. This was on the Wellesley College. I guess I'm sort of triggered by this statue. I would not want, we'll just move on from that. I don't want him there. Oh, we'll get to poor Matt. Well, we'll leave him there. All these meltdowns seemed always to come with a call for censorship and punishment. Think of the way that the feminist Twitter mob ganged up on this hapless comet scientist who was wearing an allegedly sexist shirt. I think a woman friend made it for him, and he wanted to wear it. I mean, it was a strange sartorial choice, but professors aren't known for always for their code of dress. But anyway. Some notable exceptions. Yes. Oh, me? No, thank you.
No, I meant you.
Oh, I thought you meant you. Okay. No. Think of, anyway, so this guy, Matt Taylor, a brilliant astrophysicist, and he was a key member of a team, as you all remember, who managed to land a space probe on a comet moving about 100,000 miles per hour, 300 million miles away. He did that. He was happy. He wore his shirt. But for many gender activists, they just could not get past this shirt. And I will say, I think there was more protest about this shirt from the fainting couch feminists than they've had towards, hearing about ISIS. They were more exercised and indignant that he wore this shirt. Rose Elef is a feminist technology editor at The Atlantic, and she sent out several indignant tweets about his woman objectifying shirts. Thanks for ruining the comet landing, asshole. Now, not to be harsh, but who is the asshole here? She and her allies are the ones that created a hostile environment. The fainting couch feminists, I've often noticed they're everything that they accuse others of being. They actually are. They objectify people, they dehumanize, they assume the worst about people, and then they seek to punish them and to hurt them. I mean, they really wanted him to be made to suffer, and he did. He ended up crying. They made this man cry. It was quite horrible. Now, in the early 90s, well, let me put it this way. How did this happen? Where did they come from? And I'm going to tell you very quickly that in the early 1990s, I, along with several feminist scholars, people like Wendy Kaminer and Daphne Patai, Camille Paglia, Mary Lefkowitz, Katie Roiphe, to name only a few, we went to battle against a school of feminism, which was, these kind of hard-line, conspiracy-minded, male-phobic, sex-averse feminism that came from Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin. And the critics call them the McDworkinites for short. And here is a quote from Andrea Dworkin that sort of captures, I mean, I could have chosen so many, but I just found this one that I thought sort of captured the mood of this worldview. Under patriarchy, every woman's daughter is a victim, past, present, and future. Under patriarchy, every woman's son is her potential betrayer, and also the inevitable rapist or exploiter of another woman. Talking about our sons, I mean, this whole idea that there are two teams. There's, Venus and Mars, and there's a single trophy, and we've got to fight for Venus, and Mars is a vile. This whole worldview is so untrue to reality. Men and women, we're in this together, and this was sort of we fought this, and we won. We won the argument. And in those days, the New York Times, the media was on our side. The New York Times, New York Magazine, everyone was laughing, and no one, very few people outside little enclaves at the university took what they were saying seriously. And even feminists like Betty Friedan and Adrienne Rich, they fought back against the McDworkinites. And the McDworkinites lost. They lost the argument, but they quietly assumed the assistant professorships. And so colleges are now full of gender scholars and experts who instruct students in the ravages of the patriarchy and how innocent women are preyed upon by lethally dangerous men, their sons, their husbands, their fathers. It's all, to me, it's as if you've read 1984, George Orwell's, in that book, The Junior Anti-Sex League, it's as if the Junior Anti-Sex League has occupied feminism. Well, why do we hear so much about them now? They've always been there. There have been eccentric feminists in universities, especially this university, for a long time. And they might have wanted people to practice censorship, and they would have wanted to get somebody in trouble for his shirt and so forth. But no one listened to them. Why are people listening today? And I just want to tell you that there is a reason that we're hearing about them today. And it's a very specific event in 2011. A little-known officer in the Department of Education, an assistant secretary, her name is Ruslan Ali. She was in the Department of Education, and she sent out a letter to every college in the country, reading them the riot act about how they were handling sexual harassment and sexual assault on campus. Now, unfortunately, she got her data from McDworkinites. She said there was a plague, of predation on campus, and she wanted to take draconian measures. And she told the colleges, if you don't do it, if you allow any hint, even of just sexism, she gave that idea to the colleges, then you risk your federal funding. And the colleges, immediately fearful of their funding, and counseled by risk-averse lawyers, I presume, they have just clamped down on all manifestations of sexuality. Even your students are warned about jokes. Students are getting in trouble for, I was just at Ohio University last night, and a couple of years ago, there's a group of students, actually they were from SDS, but it wasn't the SDS that was here tonight. It was called Students Defending Students. And it was a group that if you got in trouble, they would defend you. And they wanted to attract members to their club, and they had little T-shirts And on their T-shirts, they had a logo that the dean saw and, must have thought, it's a Title IX violation, you can't wear them, ordered them not to wear these shirts. And what was this? Oh, and she also told them that the slogan was sexist and encouraged prostitution. Now, what did it say? This is a legal group that'll help you. And on the shirt it said, we'll get you off for free. Oh my God, we'll get you off for free. Fortunately, they picked on the wrong group because one young man, Isaac Smith, he just knew this was wrong. A dean shouldn't be able to tell him not to wear this shirt. And he's at a public university. And the last time we checked, the United States is, Ohio University is in the United States and is a free speech zone because the Bill of Rights applies. He took it to court. He went to federal court and he won. The university had to pay him $32,000 and restore the Bill of Rights to the student guidebook, code book. But anyway, that's the kind of thing that's going on. And I haven't even talked about, by what we see all over the campus. Well, this is the letter. It doesn't matter. You can't really read it. But after that letter, it empowered these groups on campus. And before long, otherwise sensible people came to believe that schools like Swarthmore and Yale or the University of Michigan, that they were among the most dangerous places on earth for young women. And by 2014, 2015, it was a full-scale panic. You had this young woman, Emma Sulkowicz, carrying a mattress around her school to shame a young man who had been found not guilty, even by the new standards of the Department of Education. He had been found not responsible. And yet, so it was really a kind of vigilante action, but it was totally condoned by the school. So, one Harvard law, and I won't even go into the nightmare of these campus kangaroo courts where young men are brought in and put through horrendous, they're tried for this serious crime of rape. And we now have, at last time I counted, it was over 60 young men who are suing, and you read through these cases, and these tribunals sound like something out of a Soviet show trial. And I think Alan Dershowitz captured the mood on campus when he said, this new campus regime, he said, was created by people who believe that sexual assault is so heinous a crime that even being innocent is not a defense. So, as I said, we have dozens of falsely accused young men subject to this horrendous. The classical equity feminism that I believe in, it's about respect, equality. I became a feminist because I did not appreciate male chauvinism, but the answer to male chauvinism is not female chauvinism. The antidote to sexist injustice against women is not to, turn around and practice sexist injustice against men. And it's unfortunate that, I just want to, before I conclude, I want to consider a counter-argument. I can imagine, and I've heard people say this, maybe if someone in here will say some version of this later, they'll say, I agree with you that the trigger warnings, there are a lot of antics that are a little out of control, and that the safe spaces and all that's a little silly, over the top. It's too bad that young men are suffering. But, sexism, harassment, sexual assault, it's serious, it's an abiding problem. And maybe we just have a group of young women right now on campus who aren't going to take it anymore. And you might not agree with their methods, maybe you're too old to understand, but they are going to stand up to it. And rather than criticizing them, you should try to understand them. And radical groups, they always go too far, but sometimes that's what progress looks like. Maybe we're just looking at progress. Now, I've considered this argument, and here's why I think it's exactly wrong. A determined reform movement that has a solid grasp on human reality, that group can change the world for the better. I mean, think of Gandhi or Martin Luther King or great heroes of any authentic liberation movement, of the gay rights movement and the women's movement, the civil rights movement. These movements, you had people, as I said, that had a grasp of moral reality. But what do we have today with these fainting couch feminists I think they have a rather tenuous grasp of reality. They seem to be inflamed by conspiracy theories and exaggerated statistics about their own victimization and the toxicity of another group. That combination is known to breed zealotry. I mean, think it's the McCarthy era or the 1980s when we had these, there was this panic over satanic cults in daycare centers, and innocent people were put on trial. Or even the Salem witch trials. Sometimes I went back and read about the Salem witch trials when I just looked at this growing panic on campus, and I wanted to find out, like, what made them, why did it dissipate? What does it take? I'm still not clear on the answer. History is one long lesson in the danger of combining moral fervor with misinformation. Now, I could be wrong, and I'm open to evidence that I'm mistaken, but on many of our campuses, maybe the University of Minnesota is an exception, although there were some manifestations here tonight. What I see is fanaticism, intolerance of dissent, hysteria over sexuality, shouting down speakers, angry mobs crying for someone's head on a platter, all supported by a foundation of propaganda that is beyond the reach of rational analysis. These are not features of an authentic liberation movement. These are features of an irrational cult. At this very moment, university administrators under pressure from the federal government are quietly amending the U.S. Constitution. Freedom of expression is being replaced by a woman's right to feel comfortable. Due process is being treated as a barrier to justice rather than its essence. And comedians are staying away from the campus for fear of triggering somebody. Armies of gender apparatchiks are on campus and in the social media. They are monitoring and policing speech, ideas, humor, sexuality, even shirts. American colleges have been described as islands of repression in a sea of freedom. So Milo and I are here this evening to urge rebellion and unrest among the islanders. So thank you for being a nice audience, relatively nice. I was going to say no one fled the room, but some people were carried out of the room. That's different. No one fled. No triggered pets. So both clapping and jazz hands are most welcome. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much to both of you for coming. We're going to start straight off with a couple questions for Twitter. If you do have note cards, just pass them to the middle, and people on the end would hold them up. We do have two ushers collect them. So our first question, and I know Milo's got strong opinions about this, but we've talked about feminism as a whole, but how do you explain male feminists, especially our friends with the air horns?
Male feminism is a sort of disease. It's a sort of brain disease brought about by, I think, low self-esteem and lack of sex. There seems to be an undercurrent in the modern progressive movement of men who are so desperate to get laid they will say literally anything. Some of those things can involve demonizing their own skin color, sexuality, and gender simply in order to get plaudits from some of the most awful women on campus. I think male feminism is a very odd phenomenon. It seems to have, this sort of particular kind of progressive male feminism seems to have popped up only really in the last couple of years, and you'll see it sometimes on the pages of Vox and BuzzFeed and Gawker and Mike and terrible places like that. And it seems mainly a result of a failure in journalism, actually. It's a failure in the way that we, as commentators and interpreters of the world, are considering our role, not as imparters of knowledge or as people who are supposed to be out there and finding the truth, but rather journalism's become about virtue signaling. And for too many of my colleagues, the primary purpose of their job, what they get up to do in the morning, is to advertise their own moral virtue. instead of telling us about the world as it really is, instead of telling us what the problems are out there and what the various different approaches to that might be, the function of the majority of journalism, particularly I have to say on the left, appears to be to advertise what nice, right-thinking people we are and how much we hate sexism and racism and all that kind of thing. Now, that sort of narrative over fact, the relinquishing of evidence-based reporting in favor of a sort of narrative-based journalism that seeks to tell important stories whether or not the facts are right, is harmful for precisely the people that it is supposed to help. And the most obvious example is rape reporting. So look at Duke Lacrosse, look at UVA, look at the Jackie hoax, you look at Emma Solkowitz at the University of Columbia. The net result of journalists who don't really care about the truth, but just want to advertise what good people they are, and in very many cases these are men, particularly the male editors who commission this stuff. The result of this is that fewer women are believed, because of course these stories fall apart, because the journalist's primary purpose in writing it wasn't to tell the truth, wasn't to find out what actually happened, wasn't to unearth wrongdoing, wasn't to punish miscreants, but was rather simply to paint a picture of how he thinks the world ought to look. It's very dangerous for anybody who cares about the truth. It's very dangerous for any kind of academic inquiry, and it's cancer to journalism. And this seems to be a cancer, so I call it a disease. It seems to be a cancer that has infected the majority of American journalism. It's absolutely horrifying. And its apotheosis is the male feminist, as, you know, of sort of, I don't know, Vox and BuzzFeed folklore. A guy who will say anything, no matter how insane, knowingly lie to his readers. This goes way beyond negligence and into outright mendacity. Shit all over his own skin color and gender and sexuality. Brazenly lie about good, decent people, as we saw in the Gamergate controversy, which is the greatest professional failure I've ever seen in journalism. All for what? To advertise that he's a nice guy. It's a very, so when I say it's a sort of disease, I don't mean it lightly. It is the biggest problem in American journalism, and I'm willing to bet it's a significant component in the problems in American academia too.
What he meant to say is they're well-intended but misguided.
So next question is, why is the left so obsessed with putting people into categories?
I can start if you like.
You start.
All right. Well, I'm a sort of beneficiary of... What?
Nothing.
You're in the category of moms,
Yes.
and right now mom has to listen. Is that mansplaining? Sunsplaining?
Sunsplaining.
Sunsplaining. I think the left is insistent on doing this because it doesn't have very good arguments. So instead it seeks to win on identity instead of reason. If you are a woman, or you are gay, or you are black, you're given special conversational and argumentative privileges, and you're excused from making good arguments. One of the reasons the left gets so upset when people like us talk, and they do this sort of disruptive nonsense instead of asking good questions at the end. And let's face it, if you're a smart person, and you have confidence in your own arguments, and you really wanted to nail a speaker like, me, I mean, I overspeak sometimes, I, occasionally use imprecise language. It wouldn't be that hard to do an amazing gotcha question that would go viral on the internet and embarrass me, but they don't do that because they have no confidence in their own arguments. What they do instead is just seek to sort of shut you up with noise and blah, 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 because they're used to delegitimizing speakers rather than interrogating arguments. And I've been a beneficiary of this because I've, sort of break the rule. I break the leftist rule, like gay people aren't supposed to believe these things. There must be something wrong with you. Are you self-loathing? What happened to you? Like, what is up here? This is it's an intellectual failing of the left based on decades of laziness, having never really been, because they were never really challenged on this stuff. And when a woman or a gay man says, well, hold up, let's look at the study you just cited, they lose their shit.
And I'll just add that I think it also comes from the way they view society as just a power struggle with groups. It's all about power. And the individual gets lost. And I saw this a long time ago when I was writing my book, I guess it was Who Stole Feminism, I went to a conference. This was in 1992 in Austin, Texas. And it was the National Women's Studies Association. And I was going to write about it, and so I went. And the first day, they broke us up into groups based on our anger and healing needs. I had taken my sister with me, who's a clinical psychologist, and she's found it all very clinically quite interesting. And then we broke into little groups based on our healing and grievance identity, and none of these groups proved stable. So there were groups of, there were gay and straight groups, there were black women, Hispanic women, there were Jewish women, and oversized women. And then, but inside each group, they started to bicker. And so the Jewish group broke into two groups. Some of them were gay, some were straight, or some of them wanted to embrace their Judaism, others wanted to recover from it, and they were fighting. And then you had, it was a continuous process of kind of mitosis and division. It was like a victimology spinning out of control. And then finally, a new group came, women with allergies, and they were furious at everyone and demanded that at the next National Women's Studies Association, we show compassion for our sisters in the NWSA, and we don't wear perfume or dry cleaned clothes. I don't know what that was about. Anyway, by the end of the conference, my sister said, Christina, this is like a meeting of borderline personalities. They have borderline personality disorder. What is this? I said, oh no, it's just,
Feminism.
Campus feminists. I was used to it. Well, those women went back to, they've been teaching ever since, and they've passed this mood along to their students, and now it's sort of intersectional feminism, but they all seem to meet at the intersection of paranoia, hysteria, and rage.
Is there a foreseeable end to the feminist movement, or will they always proceed on to more and more minute
Give me 6 months.
No, I want to say a good word for the feminist movement, because it didn't just start with these women hijacked a movement, a noble movement. If you ask Americans, are you a feminist, the vast majority say no. The polls show it's a tiny percentage who will want to identify with that word. I always find that sad, because it is a movement that it's a term that designates the emancipation of women. And the emancipation of women, the freedom of women, the first and second wave of feminism, those are great chapters in the history of human freedom. And so young women should identify with it, people should be proud of it. What's interesting is that when pollsters ask, do you believe in equality of the sexes? Do you think men and women should have the same opportunities? Do you want, they ask parents, do you have the same ambitions for your son and your daughter? And they say yes. So I see that as a triumph of equity feminism, and something we should be proud of and protect, and help other women across the globe who are struggling to get what we have. And I meet them at international women's conferences. And it's shocking to me to go to places like Oberlin and Georgetown and meet women that call themselves feminists, but they're not really even aware of the struggles of women across the globe. They should be concerned and reaching out, making common cause with them, but they're more concerned about their own oppression and protecting themselves from the young men at Swarthmore or the young men at Wesleyan who are oppressing them. So in their minds, they're incapable of really effective feminism. So I don't want to give it up. I don't want it to go away. But the last thing I'll say is my feminism today is what people say, well, don't you want rights for men? And I do. I want equality, and I do call it feminism because that's what feminism is supposed to be. It's supposed to be about human equality between men and women. So it's still worth fighting for.
I take a slightly different view, only because I think what the statistics show about the abandonment of feminism by women I think what it demonstrates very clearly is that women recognise what the rest of us recognise, which is feminism has become a sort of hateful, peculiar ideology that damages women too. Was it 28 to 18% of American women in just 2 years went? There was that sort of incredible crash of women supporting feminism. In the UK, where we're much more sensible about these things than you guys, just 7% of women describe themselves as feminists. So I'm very proud of Britain for once. But it seems to me that in this hierarchy of victimhood, absurdities are created whereby feminism actually sort of actively works against the interests of women. I mean, look at the transgender issue, for instance. We don't need to get into whether you believe that particular surgery is the right treatment pathway, which is completely forbidden to discuss. But look at what happens in the Olympics or in MMA fighting, where feminists are insisting that men who have recently announced themselves as women must be treated as though they were biological women at all costs, or you're a bigot and you deserve to die. And these people go into these fights and beat the crap out of women. These are effectively men beating up women for sport, and they're allowed to do that by a sort of feminism that has privileged, transgender people over actual women, to the point where a man won Woman of the Year. Caitlyn Jenner won Glamour magazine's Woman of the Year. I mean,
I thought she looked pretty good.
Well, she looks good, but it's almost an admission by feminism that women can't even win that.
Moving on.
I mean, we won Woman of the Year. No, I do think
I can't think of it. Can you give an example of where a man is, a man who is transitioned to be a woman is beating up women?
It happens in MMA fighting. The woman's name is something Fox, thank you. See, they know. It happens routinely. And now the Olympics Committee is saying the same thing. The Olympics Committee is now saying that transgender women should be able to compete as women. That is... Say again?
The Olympics is limiting testosterone levels, at least.
Well, I mean, who knows? But...
Well, we'll see how that works out. But let's go on.
Mom's had enough of that one.
Okay, so the University of Minnesota student government this past summer passed affirmative consent standards, which the university then adopted for sexual conduct. What is the best way to oppose this unconstitutional measure?
Well, I can't. Nobody wants that one.
Just let it go to a court. Let a court.
Yeah, I mean, look.
It is legally incoherent. How can you prove that someone consented unless you take pictures or take videos?
There's an app,
Oh, there is?
No, there is. There's an app, and it's made by one of these batty lefty charities, and you can basically sign it with your finger like you would on a
But then you'll have
thing.
people say, I signed it under duress.
Yeah, well, he had my finger.
I was drinking.
I signed it, but I withdrew consent between the third and fourth thrusts.
Oh.
I mean, I don't know. Camille Purlier writes intelligently on this, and I think so does Ayn Rand, actually, not purposefully, but there isn't. This is a very dangerous thing to say, and
please, what are you going to say?
Since it's the name of the tour, I'll be as delicate as I can, but I can speak from personal experience. I mean, sex is not all boring box ticking. Is this okay? Can I put it in now? That's not really how sex, and it's particularly not how the best sex works. Now, I'm not saying that all sex involves, ambiguous consent, because that, does get us into dangerous territory. I don't think that's true. But it is true that in some of the best sex, there are powerful emotions and power relationships at play. And affirmative consent seems to me, quite aside from being, as it obviously is, legally incoherent, just not very much fun. And it seems to me to destroy much of what is good about the sort of recreational sexual liberation and freedom that previous generations of feminists fought so hard for. That certainly we can probably agree on that much.
Here's where we certainly agree, is that I think that a lot of this is driven by a kind of bias in our society that we haven't talked about. There was a time, and it's still true, in many parts of the world and even in this country, where there was a lot of demonization of homosexuality. Now, that's certainly on the left, that's gone, but now there's a demonization of male heterosexuality. Male sexuality is being pathologized, demonized, and criminalized. And so a young man, 18, 19, who tries to kiss a girl, and that it's still the custom. I mean, the boy kisses the girl, and because I've read a lot of these cases and what's going on the campus. But then it could turn 3 months later. This happened to a young man at Wesleyan who's suing because it sort of ruined his life because of this campus tribunal. He was accused of non-consensual kissing, and so a young man that makes the wrong move. I mean, if you don't want to be kissed, there are many ways women can show that and have been able to repel him, push him away. But now you can go and report him for this. So who is going to want to kiss a girl? And a lot of girls would like to be kissed. And so it seems to me that there was a kind of secret war on normative sexuality. And how do you fight back? It's kind of taken us all by surprise. It was weaponized, this angry war on male sexuality by the Department of Education. And now you've got senators, both sides, Republicans and Democrats, working together more and more on these little laws and bylaws to bring the campus in line so that we don't have a rape culture. The rape culture, as they define it, as it is now being defined, is just seduction. Is now, by some definitions, it's considered rape. Or certainly assault. And I talk to young women, I say, well, you don't want to say that it's rape, if someone sort of sweet talk to you and, yes, I do, and they look, these sort of steely-eyed, and this is where we are. So how do you fight it? I'm not sure. The first thing is to do what we're doing, is to just sort of speak out against it. And some wise person said the voice of reason is small but persistent. So join the lobby. We need a lobby for reason.
I mean, the problem is that normal human sexuality is becoming injudicious to pursue, where it is not becoming outright illegal. And the consequence of this, again, another terrible consequence of feminism for women, is that men are retreating. And men are retreating into all sorts of things. It's porn, video games. I wrote a thing called the Sexodus. Other people, there's another movement called MGTOW, men going their own way. These were previously, communities on the internet were very small, were considered a little odd. Some of the men in them were, didn't have the best social skills, and that's perhaps why they didn't have a lot of success in relationships. But now you've got, and I talk to them all the time, now you've got athletic, attractive, socially fluent, wealthy, ordinary guys who just aren't interested in relationships with women because they don't want to get involved in any of that drama. And there isn't an easy answer to this because campuses are, in many ways, extremely hostile to young men. They are hostile places for men to be. So people sometimes ask me, the best way to fight back against, the craziness on campuses. And the best, I don't have a good answer for you either. The best thing that I've come up with so far is keep your head down, get your education, and when you get out into the real world where the rules of reality begin to reassert themselves, you can begin to have more of a successful and healthy, happy, normal sex life and all the rest of it. But on campus, it's dangerous.
Okay. Great. As a male to female post-op transsexual, what advice could you provide in dealing with feeling pushed out of the left as a moderate? P.S. Caitlyn Jenner is not a hero, Gamergate is about ethics and journalism, and the Westboro Baptist Church has the same right to self-expression as I do.
Who is this person? Where is he here? This person here? Don't know. No, well, thank you for that. That's an excellent question, and you sound great.
One of my Twitter followers.
Was it?
Yeah, I have a number of people that they're just, total free speech, and then you would think from their identity that they would be, with the regressive left, and they're not. They're free thinkers, and I love that.
I'm planning a stream. I sometimes do long streams where I just get a load of guests on. I'm planning one called Based Trannies, where I get on a load of really cool transgender people who do not sign up to the crazy prescriptions of the progressive left. And we've got about 6 or 7 so far. We get to 10.
There are more.
Oh, there are loads. No, there are loads. And they're transgender people who just do not feel represented by the bonkers language policing trans lobby that they feel does not represent them at all. And some of these people are, sort of brilliant, creative, fascinating people who just, I don't know what, maybe you have more insight in this, but there seems to be a sort of small cohort of these furiously brilliant free speech warriors among the transgender community who are very smart and very outspoken and very and quite angry about the way they've been represented in the media and what's done to people in their name. I mean, here's the dirty secret about transgenderism is nobody cares about it, right? Nobody really cares about this, but the left has forced us to take a political position on it by turning it into, as Time magazine put it, the next civil rights frontier. Now, from my point of view, that phrase should only really be used about black people. But the left, as soon as it won that one, started applying this phrase civil rights to other things to give them the same sort of gravitas. Well, nobody really cares about this subject.
I don't agree with that. I think that there was a lot of bullying and suffering, and there's a reason that I do see it as a authentic.
But why is it on the cover of Time and Glamour and Vanity Fair? Why should we care about this? Well, this is simply a political manoeuvring by the left to force us into taking a political position on what's actually a medical issue in order to just exclude even more people who refuse to sign up to the groupthink.
Next question.
So for a lot of topics you cover, your opinions seem to be quickly dismissed with sweeping statements such as, oh, he just hates women or she has internalized misogyny. How do you counter these dismissive notions that happen besides your clear use of statistical data?
Well, I guess I'm the one with the internalized misogyny.
I have some men inside me from time to time.
I find that very interesting, and it's especially...
Sorry.
No.
Sometimes they just come to you and you forget.
I find it interesting that among a certain group of feminists whom I criticize, they always say, well, we have to listen to women. That was in the very beginning, in the second wave of feminism. There was hearing women's voices and letting women, tell the truth about their experience. Except if you tell the truth and you have an experience that doesn't fit their blueprint, then you are considered a victim of internalized misogyny. This comes up a lot about when we have discussions about the wage gap. There is no one has been able to find systemic injustice in wages. It's almost all explained by the jobs men do, as Milo said, what you study in school, how many hours you work per week. And men and women just are different, as taken as a group in the workplace. And when you do the proper controls, most of the wage gap narrows to the point of vanishing. I mean, if you could take this university, they'll just fire all the men and have only women run the university that way, and you'll give the students a 25% a reduction on their tuition, and you'd have just as good a university. Well, you'd have a very different university, and so any company that it's just different, and so. What the reason there's a wage gap largely is that women enter fields that don't pay as well. So in this school, large numbers of women are probably in education, and men are overrepresented in engineering. Engineering pays more. If you want to earn a lot of money, and I told this to the students at Oberlin, I said, if you want to close the wage gap, don't major in feminist dance therapy. Go into petroleum engineering. And somebody screwed, I should be able to major in whatever I want. I said, yes, you should. And that's great, but you will earn less money if you major in what you want. And men make money because they don't major. They may well want to major in, well, probably not feminist dance therapy, but that's something else. Anyway, my point is about internalized misogyny. The feminists will say, well, and I've heard the AAUW say this, the American Association of University Women, I've heard the National Organization for Women say, women are in a pink ghetto because through socialization, they've internalized the values of the society, and so they go into the nurturing and caring professions instead of, being electrical engineers. So it's an internalized misogyny, or not misogyny, but in this case, stereotypes have driven them to make these decisions. What they're essentially saying is these women aren't free. Now, I could accept that kind of analysis in a society where women have no education, or very little education, no access to information. American women we must be the most informed people on the planet in terms of our possibilities. Young women today know that they can be what they want to be, and there's a lot of encouragement. And I think that the feminists should credit them with agency. And I think it's very matronizing, to use my favorite word, to say they don't have free will. And then the question arises, well, how do we know that, if they're saying they don't have free will, how do we know that the feminist who's criticizing them has free will? And I can tell you as a philosopher, free will and has been debated for a few thousand years. There's no resolution in sight. And for the meantime, I think we should credit one another with agency. And so I don't appreciate when people say, I've internalized misogyny. I don't like hearing it about other women. And it's philosophically incoherent as an analysis. So
it also doesn't stack up with the facts. I mean, you make this point, I think you told me this, if you believe that there is some sort of socialized, sexist, patriarchal, internalized, misogynistic reason why women don't choose to do physics and maths, you have to explain why there isn't any of that with biology and veterinary medicine, which are just as difficult subjects, equally, totally dominated by women. There are plenty of subjects that,
Well, what the feminists, they say, well, women aren't in physics and because there are no role models, or because there haven't been enough, there's no mentors. Well, there were no mentors in veterinary medicine when it was mostly male. And there were lots of fields, law and psychology, a lot of fields were dominated by men, and the women wanted to go there. There was no stopping us. We went. Journalism, women love that. These used to be male fields. So it's odd that it would be because physicists are somehow more threatening than lawyers, or something.
Seems unlikely. I mean, and it always strikes me as a bit rich when feminists talk about mentorship. I mean, if you take the example of the tech and gaming industries, the startup industries, these feminists and progressives are bullies, so they pick on weak targets. They pick on weak targets like the kind of guys who work at startups and who enjoy video games because they don't have much social capital. They pick on them because it's easy. And in the tech industry, for instance, probably the preeminent feminist organization until it shut down in chaos was the Ada Initiative. Well, what were they doing for women? They were terrifying men away from mentoring young girls, away from
this
giving
is a huge problem.
Away from giving young girls mentorship because they were trying to do these stings. They were setting up. They wanted to set up Linus Torvalds, the inventor of the Linux kernel. If that means nothing to you, it doesn't matter. All you need to know is he's just a really important computer guy. And they were trying to honey trap him, getting a woman in the same room as him to say that he had sexually assaulted her. And they were trying to do it with other things as well, to sort of spread the message that, women have a hard time in tech by lying and making false accusations. And this was a very well-respected feminist organization in Silicon Valley. And many others are like this. What's the end result? Well, people like Eric Raymond, who's a great sort of luminary of the hacking world, and other men who had previously taken women under their wing, been the best possible mentors you could imagine, at the very pinnacle of their fields, won't even be in the same room alone as a woman now. And that's a direct result of third wave feminism. It's a direct result of the sort of crazy, runaway, sociopathic, hideous movement that feminism has turned into. And this is not unique to technology and not unique to that.
It's happened in the universities.
Yeah, and this
I hear it from professors.
And this is it's common in education to hear this stuff. And yet another example of how feminism hurts women most.
Okay.
Never quite sure when to start the next question because I figure there's always a round of applause somewhere out there.
I was worried about the last one. I wasn't sure.
Okay. Men are known to be more likely to ask for a raise. Is this attributable to social conditioning?
No, I don't think. I mean, possibly, partly. Everything's a combination of biology and culture. But we know that if you look at cross-cultural studies, men are more risk-taking, assertive, and women tend to be more there's no country known in the entire anthropological record where the women were pushing themselves forward as, the warriors and the taken, and then the men were the nurturing and caring. It just hasn't happened. And it's almost as if we're captive to this delusionary view of, the sexes are just cognitively interchangeable. We're all the same except for what culture does. Well, somewhere there would be a culture that did it differently. Where are they? So, and we see it is in even little tiny boys and girls. And you see who's just more assertive and more risk-taking. If you look, you can measure these things. You can look at who ends up in emergency rooms among 3-year-olds. It's more boys, far more boys than girls. This sort of thing. So it's partly a male trait to have that kind of assertiveness. And so I, for one, think it's something you should tell girls about and inform them, and that's very easy to do. I mean, there's a lot of talk about that, so it's something that can be corrected, although some of us would still be shy. But on the other hand, I have a friend. It's actually my son. His first job, I said, well, what's the salary? And he said, I thought it would be rude to ask. And I thought, oh, my God, So I don't know that boys are always, and young men are always that assertive either, in all situations.
I mean, practically speaking, one of the problems with this sort of closed-mindedness in science, or this sort of this obsessive focus on one half of a more complete whole about what makes us people and what goes into our gender identity, what goes into the sorts of people we are, is that it's used to justify unfairnesses. The 2015 Cornell study showed that men were that women were twice as likely to get STEM jobs because everybody's so desperate to hire women, because there is this, nonsense sort of supposition about patriarchal systems, all the rest of it. Now, frankly, if women aren't good at asking for raises, that's not a man's problem. That's not a man's fault either. But these sorts of weird kind of theories about socialization are used to gerrymander board quotas. They're used to create sort of special pleading for minority groups that that don't need it. When you've got more women going to university, getting higher grades at university, more of them entering the workplace, by some metrics, women earning more than men under 30 now as a group. Women don't need it, but this sort of weird, blinkered and in some cases just outright bogus science is used to inflict, architectural, sort of structural unfairness on men in the way that feminists say that they had it in the past, and I'm sure in many respects they did. Of course they did. But it seems to me we can be a better and more enlightened society than visiting the sins of our fathers, onto our children. And it seems to me that, if feminists really want to reconstruct a sort of parody of original sin, where they are visiting the sins of prior generations on their own sons and their own, daughters, that strikes me not as a sort of evidence-based advocacy movement, but just as a poisonous cult.
Okay, question for Milo. Do you see a correlation between the popularity of Donald Trump and the pushback against feminism?
Now, you see, this is complicated by the fact that I call Trump Daddy. I've like many modern broken homes, I evidently have two sets of parents. No, I think that much of what's going on the progressive left, the movement away from evidence and the movement toward a sort of weird, ugly, nasty, sociopathic, bullying horror show against anybody who, doesn't have a claim to victimhood, certainly people are a bit sick of that, and Donald Trump has become emblematic of a sort of guerrilla resistance. Now, Donald Trump supporters come in many flavors. The ones that I know the best, and the one that I would call myself, are the sort of dissident, alternative, free speech-loving mischief makers who see a lazy, ossified establishment which doesn't tell the truth anymore and bullies some groups in what are simply outrageously and outright sexist ways. I mean, look at the sort of applause you'll get on the left for saying things like masculinity so fragile on a recent feminist hashtag, or kill all white men, or I bathe in male tears. This is outright hatred. It is nasty, bitter, vicious, gender-based hatred. It's horrible, and it comes from an establishment that has made it open season on certain sections of society. I think that's wrong. When you make it dangerous to respond to hatred like that without endangering your job, your friends, your life, you create the conditions for people like Trump to appear, people who will say what they want, will be brash and open and forthright, and you may not agree with all their policy prescriptions, but you can at least enjoy the spectacle of them annoying all of the worst people in the world. And in that respect alone, I'm a big fan. So yes, I do. I think it's wider than that. I think there are racial issues, I think there are economic issues, but certainly there is, I've observed, a sort of section of Trump's fan base which seems to be motivated by this sort of oppressive, progressive feminism. So yeah, I think they're related.
Okay.
See, this is the bit of Trump that I think you might be able to at least appreciate from a distance.
No, what you said, that I appreciate, but I actually, I think that a lot of Trump's supporters, I think both political parties forgot a huge sector of American life, which was the working class, especially in men who had been working in industries that disappeared, and young men who are not going to college, who are not part of the college class, are just forgotten and lost. And I think that's where his following is coming from. And I think both parties better figure out a way to do something for these people. And it's partly ignoring male education. Britain is ahead of us. You're not succeeding yet, but you're trying. And the United States, everyone knows it's a huge problem. We know that our educational system, for whatever reason, across all races, social classes, it works better for women than it does for men. And there is a huge number of young men who are barely literate, who have hardly any education beyond high school, and their chances of making it into the middle class are very slim to none. There was a time in this country where all you had to do was graduate from high school, and if you were a hard worker, you could make a living and support a family. You can't now. And American economists and politicians should have paid attention to that and found ways to strengthen our educational system and engage those young men in education and bring them, into the economy. They didn't do it. And so we have a lot of young men who are not going to find a place for themselves in the information economy. And I think those are a lot of the Trump supporters.
Just to add very quickly, I mean, a common criticism that's made of the sort of feminism that I don't like is that it's as much a class war as it is a gender war. That much of it is perpetrated by white middle-class women who are the most privileged group in the history of our civilization, of our species. They are the most privileged people ever to have lived. Modern white white middle-class women in the West. It's tough to imagine a group that's had it better ever. Sort of waging war on working-class men. Now, most of my readers fall into that second category, and I see the sort of injustice perpetrated on them and the sort of language that's used about them, and I see parallels in the way that the Republican establishment talks about its own voters, about its own base. You've got Rick Wilson, this GOP strategist, going on Fox News saying that these are all sort of anime-watching weirdos. And I just think to myself, you know what, Rick Wilson, fuck you. Because I might not dress like those guys, and I might not have the same accent as the people you're talking about, but you're basically talking about me too. Because I don't like the establishment very much. I'm not, a typical member of the middle classes. I don't have lots of media friends and all the rest of it. I've sort of given that up because I don't like what goes with it. I don't like lying for a living, which you have to do if you're a journalist in a mainstream publication these days. And I just thought to myself, if this is how party establishments talk about their own base, is it any wonder that powers like Trump are rising? And I see feminism in very much the same way. It is a sort of class hatred and class hostility perpetrated by well-fed, well-educated coastal bloggers on all the rest of us.
Yes, I forgot to say one thing. I explained why I thought Trump was attractive to many people. But I don't think he's going to be able to help them, so I don't support him. I do not think he will. I don't think he can. I think you better, if you support him, you better be careful, because if I do not think he has the experience to do this. I better not say.
If you tell me you're a Sanders supporter, I'm going to apply to live with someone else.
Oh, no. Well, he's not that bad. I prefer him to Hillary. But,
prefer a small paper bag to Hillary.
now,
I'd rather elect an orange into the White House than Hillary Clinton.
Dr. Summers, considering equality as a metaphor which compares people to interchangeable mathematical expressions, do you believe equality is an appropriate term to be applied to individuals or groups, or does it lead us to assume false similarities and overlook important differences?
Well, first of all, what I would look for in a society is overall well-being. Are people flourishing and happy according to their terms? And so it seems to me the best analysis I've seen of in the sort of feminism that I would believe in would want not statistical parity. I don't think that if you look for statistical parity, you're going to find well-being. You could probably find more statistical parity in many fields, in the Soviet Union and Soviet bloc countries where people had very little freedom and they were sort of ordered to do this or that. And that's not a measure of freedom. If you have people say, oh, well, there were more physicists and engineers, in the Soviet Union than there are now, who were women, or they'll say in poor countries, Mexico or in Malaysia, there are more women going into computer science than in the United States. That proves that there's sexism here. Not necessarily. Maybe it proves that here we have the prosperity and the educational system that allows women to do whatever they want to do, and they may want to do other things. And so it's not that women aren't getting an education. If you look at where women are, they prevail in fields like social psychology, in the humanities, social sciences in general. In biology and veterinary medicine was mentioned, and yet you don't find as many in physics and engineering, petroleum engineering. But if somebody had come to me and said, look, you can be a petroleum engineer, you can make all this money, don't major in philosophy, I would not have been interested. But I lived in a country where I could do something so daft as get a degree in philosophy. So I think sometimes difference, if you look at men and women, and there are actually some good studies that of a very mysterious finding. Several teams of psychologists have done cross-cultural studies, and they have found that many sex differences the differences between the sexes are larger the more advanced and wealthy the society. And they said, how can that be? And there was an article about it in the New York Times, and the New York Times writer was summarizing this research, and he said, yes, it's like what these scientists are saying is that a couple in rural Botswana will be more like one another than man and wife in, Paris or New York, Minneapolis. How can that be? And what they said is that it may be that in the advanced post-industrial societies, there's more opportunity for self-realization. You can be what you really are. And so women and men, if you're in a poor country, you're a woman, you have very few choices. You have to get a job that can make a living. But here you can major in art history or
feminist dance therapy.
The dance therapy is there. And it's possible that difference in not always, but sometimes it's symptomatic. It's of freedom and of happiness and well-being. And yet we have a feminist establishment that whenever there's statistical disparity, if they think it doesn't favor women, if there's statistical disparity that favors women, that's a triumph of equity. If there's
they don't mind so much about 97% of workplace fatalities being men.
No,
you won't hear much about them from that.
You don't hear about that. And they look at the Fortune 500 and they're very angry that there are too few women there. But what about the unfortunate 50,000 who work on in sewers and, up cleaning buildings and high rises. I've never seen a woman do that. There are buildings in...
Lesbians do that.
No, they don't. What he meant to say, I don't know what he meant to say. It's just, anyway, to go back to your question, equality, I think what you want to look at is fulfillment and happiness and well-being, and that is not about statistical parity. Human flourishing is more complicated. And men and women take slightly different paths in the pursuit of happiness. We should accept that, but we don't. The feminist establishment doesn't.
It's perhaps also worth reminding ourselves that there's a very important respect in which we forget which kind of equality is important. Modern feminists want equality of outcome. They want things to look the same.
I meant to say
they
that,
want. I know. I thought you were leading up to that. They want parity, statistical parity. They want equality of outcome. When in fact, what it seems obvious to me we should be doing is simply providing people with the same access to institutions, giving people the same options in life.
Absolutely, and that's why we needed feminism, because they were
and no sensible person would disagree with that.
Right.
I think. I think any reasonable person would agree that this is one of the great triumphs and something we should be enormously proud of.
Right.
That women have those rights in the West, and they don't everywhere, and they have had them for maybe not as long as they should have, but they have them. And it's that equality of access that's important. And I think you make the point in, I can't remember which book, but that women stubbornly make choices that that feminists wish they didn't, or don't make the choices that.
Well, they're constantly disappointed with women and the choices that women make, and as I said, are always trying to explain it away. And they can't find you can still find overt sexism, but it's harder and harder to find. So now they're looking for invisible barriers and sorts of things.
This is the problem on the left generally. The left, as Douglas Murray, the British journalist, likes to say, the left has a supply and demand problem with bigotry. There isn't enough racism around. There isn't enough sexism around. There isn't enough homophobia around. So what do? You have to go out and make some. So you've got journalists calling around the entirety of America, desperately trying to find one pizzeria that will say, no, I'd rather not do a lesbian wedding. Finally, guys, we got one, and the whole media descends on this poor mom and pop show. It's like, yes, we found some bigots. Yes. The other way you do it is to broaden the definitions, of course. So it's microaggressions. It's mansplaining, manslamming. You create sexism where there was none. You invent these new forms of racism that didn't exist before. This sort of unconscious racism. You create white privilege. The idea that you could be racist or at least benefiting from a racist system without even knowing it. So all of us are racist, even though we've never had a racist thought in our lives or done a racist thing. And then, of course, you've got The Guardian 2 weeks ago saying it's not enough to not be racist, you have to be an anti-racist. They raise the bar continually to the point where I think most ordinary people sort of think, well, you're never going to be happy, so fuck you.
Well, this whole idea about male privilege. As I said, I spoke at Berkeley, I guess it was I don't know when it was, a week ago, 2 weeks ago. And the day I went there was an article by a young man in the Berkeley newspaper, the student newspaper, about how surprised he was that, I guess one of his housemates had written, was furious about male privilege and about man-spreading, and she took a picture. She was on BART, she was on the subway, and there was a homeless man, a bum, or I don't know, what's the proper term? He was asleep and taking up seats. And she took a picture. This is a young woman at Berkeley. She's taking a picture of male privilege, a homeless guy sleeping on the subway.
It's the perfect image of modern feminism. It's the perfect image of modern feminism. Is a feminist blogger walking out of her Fifth Avenue offices, finding a homeless person, and somehow making herself the victim.
She was the victim.
I also like man-slamming is my favourite thing.
What? I forget what that is.
2015. Well, I'll tell you.
Don't do it.
My favourite thing of 2015 is man-slamming, which was invented by Jessica Roy, I think, of New York Magazine. And it's supposed to describe the way that men won't walk out of the way for you, like they won't get out of your way if you're on the if you're on the sidewalk, you say, if you're on the sidewalk walking down, men will never get out the way, but women always have to jump out the way. And so this woman, this journalist went and tried this out, and she said she had experienced man slamming, the phenomenon of men just walking into her like she wasn't even there. And this was an expression of male privilege. They think they own the sidewalk. I just have this vision of this sort of like dumpy blogger hurling herself at people in the street in the desperate hope that she makes contact with some of them so she can go back and write her angry blog post about how she's the victim even though she's out in the streets assaulting people.
Well, there's a lot of fem-splaining going on. It's very annoying.
There is some fem-splaining. Do you know about fem-steering?
No.
It's a phenomenon that describes the inability of a woman to operate a motorized vehicle.
Excuse me.
It's a hazard on America's roads.
Oh, but who gets more accidents? Not women.
Well, men get into more accidents because they take more risks.
Well, they drive more. They drive more.
Men get into worse accidents. Women get into more minor scrapes and bumps because they have no spatial awareness. That's science. That's science. You're not going to want to back me up on that, but you know that's true. They have a standard deviation lower spatial awareness than men do, but because men are reckless, they get into more life-threatening life-threatening crashes. So if you're in a car with a male driver, you're less likely to be in an accident, but if you get into one, you'll probably die.
Okay.
Is Emma Watson a lost cause, and how dangerous do you think it is when uneducated celebrities get involved?
Can we have another question?
She was good in the movies.
Right. What can students do on campuses to promote free speech and equity feminism, and how would you respond to accusations of alarmism on your part?
Well, I'll answer the part about what you can do.
I'll do alarmism.
You do the alarmism. It's more your bailiwick. You all really should be part of a group called FIRE. It's the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE. And it's so big now, you just like Google FIRE, it comes up, FIRE, it's as big as FIRE. And they are, what I like about it, I guess I'm on some kind of advisory board. I'm not sure what I do exactly, but I'm somehow connected to that. I just said yes, fine. But this group is brilliant. They're the ones that helped that young man at Ohio University sue about the T-shirt. They are bipartisan. There's half the board or more liberals, the other half are conservative, but they share a commitment to freedom. And they realize, and this brilliant president, Greg Lukianoff, has written this book called, I think it's Unlearning Liberty, that we have a generation of kids that don't know their rights. They have not, because of the unusual way history was taught or something, we just don't have a generation of kids. They come to college and they think it's okay to have speech codes at public universities. It's not. And they will always be knocked down if you take it to court. FIRE will help you take it to court. If you are caught up in one of these frightening kangaroo courts on campus over a sexual assault charge and you are innocent, you go to FIRE and they help you. There was a young man at the University of New Hampshire, this was a few years back, and he lived on the top floor and he could never get an elevator. And it annoyed him, so he put a little note in the elevator. And it was all young women that lived on the lower floors. And he thought they were taking the elevator one flight up. He didn't want them. He wanted to be able to get the elevator. So he put a note and said, ladies, we all know about, as freshmen, you gain 10, 15 pounds. And what could be better than taking the stairs? And then he said, and now, trigger warning, because then he said, it'll be better for you and easier on our eyes. Okay. So he put it in the elevator. Just some kid put this in the elevator. Well, an alarmed gender activist turned it into the campus, turned it into the dorm monitor. The dorm monitor turned it into the dean. The dean called him in, and this guy was thrown out of the dorm. He had to live in his car for a while. He didn't have money to get an apartment. And then he was sentenced to go to counseling. We had to apologize. He had to have counseling, and he had to write a 3,000-word reflection essay. This was madness. Now, Fire wrote a letter to the president of the University of New Hampshire, telling her that this is a mockery of the, it's basic freedom of expression, and he had a right to do that. And they cited chapter and verse from constitutional law on free speech. And the campus eventually let him move back in and drop the charges, probably not because of Fire in this case, because Jon Stewart's and comedies, The Daily Show heard about it, was going to come up and do the story, and then the dean just said, oh, we don't want this, so they didn't do it. But the point is, Fire defended him, and these crazy things are going on. And you have, if you look at the succession of rulings by the Supreme Court, it's completely in favor of free speech, above all on the college campus. And you'll say, well, his note, that was just silly or satirical. Satirical speech is included, even profane speech. If you're conveying some message, it's protected. There were kids at the University of Missouri, this was, I think, in the 70s, who had a newspaper, and they printed a picture of I think it was a policeman raping the Statue of Liberty. Okay, they did that. The Supreme Court said it was constitutional. You have these freedoms. And so I really think it's time to become part of the free speech movement. And it was just, 50-year anniversary of the Berkeley Free Speech Movement? We need another one. And Fire is the place to go.
The thing about free speech on campus and the sort of grievance politics, the offense brigade, people are just obsessively trying to get upset about things,
right.
Is that, well, here's the ugly truth. Nothing upsets people like the truth. And the sign that young man put in the elevator was true.
It was rude, and they should have just put a note telling him what he could do to be easier on their eyes. The answer to a silly note is another silly note. Or who cares? Who even cares about the note?
Quite right. I was going to say go into plus-size Barbie, but I think I might get into trouble if we get into fat acceptance territory. But yeah, I mean, the point about this is, firstly, where responses seem to you to be absurdly disproportionate and unfair, chances are not only you're right, but B, that there are protections in place to look after you. So, yeah, I don't have much to add aside from the Barbie thing, which we won't.
So, what do you two make of the devout silence of feminists regarding the refugee rape crisis in Europe?
Oh, do you want to talk about that?
I'm going to say something that's going to offend some of you in the room. If that's the case, good, because I don't care. As a gay man, as a European, I am absolutely fucking terrified by the prospect of mass Muslim immigration. It is something that I regard with horror and terror, because we have seen in Europe, and you are relatively well insulated from this in the United States, you don't know how bad it will get yet. You're relatively well insulated from the consequences of this happening. We have seen now in Europe what does happen when you import hundreds of thousands of people from these cultures that are not compatible with ours. In Sweden, you've got the progressive left politicians telling gay rights groups that they're being needlessly provocative by marching through Muslim areas. Now, I always thought that was the whole point of gay pride, was to sort of wander through reactionary, bigoted, socially conservative communities and stick two fingers up. But apparently, if they're Islamic, that's not okay because they're higher in the victim pyramid than we are. The silence of feminism, and indeed the immediate victim blaming of young German girls after the sexual assaults in Cologne, and loads of others as well. There was a transgender couple that were beaten up after some Syrians found out they weren't really women. Women all over Germany being abused. 1,400 girls gang raped in Rotherham in the UK because the progressive authorities were scared of appearing racist and didn't police it properly. And that's not feverish tabloid right-wing media. That's a government report that said it. This stuff is horrifying. Importing cultures which genuinely represent patriarchy, which embody all of the things that third-wave feminists say they hate, and importing these people en masse into our communities in Europe has been an unmitigated disaster. Up until recently, many European cultures were melting pots of different ethnicities-ish, but what united them was a set of values. Now, a set of British, I would say, one of the reasons I love America so much is it's sort of the highest and most perfect distillation of values that the British didn't invent, but spread more successfully than probably anybody else around the world. Most of the places in the world that are a nice place to live are nice because we were there. Australia, Canada, even look at the Middle East. You know, those countries in the Middle East where women can wear what they want and don't have to cover their heads are the countries the British were in, like Kuwait. So we spread these values pretty well, and America's kind of like took them and ran with them and created this wonderful, you know, iconic society of freedom and all the rest of it. You're losing it a bit under the current president, but you did a really good job with that, and that was great. And the problem with Europe is we having successfully created societies that were melting pots of different ethnicities. The Indian immigrants who came into Britain in the 50s and 60s, who are now the best Brits there are, never get into trouble, always pay their taxes, you never see their names in the press, they never get into trouble, they get arrested for anything. Model citizens, perfect, you know, British citizens, because they instinctively understood and agreed with principles of freedom of speech, liberty, property rights, democracy, all these things. Same with the West Africans who came into Britain. You know, now the highest rates of interracial marriage are between West African origin and white people in European whites in Britain, because these West African kids all went to English schools. They came over playing cricket. They were more British than we were. You know, I was like, you actually play cricket? The problem is, this new generation of immigrants from the Middle East do not share any of those values. They haven't integrated. They have stubbornly refused to integrate over generations. Britain now sends more people to ISIS than anywhere except Belgium. There's a significant and serious problem. And I would love to hear from anyone why it is that feminism is not just making excuses for the most barbaric, woman-hating, abusive, patriarchal behavior. And there's a situation in which I don't find it ridiculous to use the word patriarchal. Why it is victim-blaming those women, telling them effectively they shouldn't be going out too late at night and they should have male companions, they should take better care of themselves. Why it has so brainwashed a young German girl that 2 days ago, this girl, we reported on this at Breitbart, posted on Facebook that although she had been sexually assaulted by a Syrian assailant, she was sorry because she didn't want to draw attention to it because it might stoke racism. You know, the fact that we've got into that situation where feminism has effectively turned on women, I would love somebody to tell me how we got there.
I'll just add one thing, that there are democracy movements. There are, in Muslim countries, there are many people that that have our values and want to bring, I mean, I meet them, I know them there, I work with them, and the forces of darkness that you described, they're destroying a lot of people there. They try to wipe out the democratic forces. And so what I would like to see the women's groups here, you know, find the feminists there to try to change those societies. And then when we have immigration, and that's something that's wonderful, has been wonderful about the West, is increasingly being open. But then if your society has values and of openness, then, and you invite people, then there should be some kind of process where they agree to abide by the values of that society. And I had a friend who was living in Amsterdam, and she said there were people that were taking their daughters out of school at 5 or 6, 7 years old to stay home, and then sometimes they would be shipped off and to arranged marriages back in wherever they'd come from. And this is where I think the Europeans just failed entirely, is not insisting on the liberal tradition they believe in, and welcoming people who love that tradition or who want to learn it, and it's just tragic because there are probably many of those migrants, they do want to do that, but now it's all poisoned, It's going. I have no idea where it's going to end, and now apparently there's going to be another huge influx. Europe almost can't cope. And
no, Germany certainly can't. And you're insulated from this geographically, really, because the only Muslims that in America are either middle class or terrorists. They're middle class because they've got the money to come here. So they tend to be nice, normal, ordinary people who believe in relatively Western values or completely Western values, or at university they may be your friends. Perfectly nice, decent, wonderful people. Or there are people who come here to do awful things. But because you don't have the land connections and the proximity, there's just a certain sort of, obvious economic problem with lots of very poor people taking long-haul flights to America to escape privation when there are obviously much closer places for them to go to. So you're relatively well insulated from some of this, but you won't be if the next president is Bernie Sanders, because he's going to do the same thing as Justin Trudeau in Canada, which is ship them here.
Milo, do you want to become a citizen or remain the odd cousin who only comes around to cause trouble?
No, because I don't want to pay American taxes. No, I think this is both, by most metrics, the best country in the world. I think it's still, despite the unfortunate movements of the last two terms, your move towards European-style socialized healthcare and the kind of stuff that we've been talking about, things going off the rails. By most general metrics, this is still the best place to live. If you would have the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, I think you would want to be born here above anywhere else in the world. Maybe a couple of Scandinavian countries, but you'd be bored out of your mind. You'd have a nice house, but there's nothing to do. I think this is by most metrics the best country in the world. One thing that does encourage me to move here was the news that somebody was prosecuted somebody's been arrested by the police in England for posts they made about migrants that were allegedly offensive, and the police specifically said that they were going to start clamping down on offensive statements on social media. Now, I don't suppose that only goes to things about immigration. That's going to go for gender too. And it's going to be people who disagree with feminist orthodoxy who are next deemed to be wrong thinkers and to be so offensive they have to be arrested. And if you don't believe me, just look at Canada, which does this stuff a little bit crazier and a little bit earlier than everywhere else, and look at the case of Gregory Allen Elliott, somebody who was put through a criminal trial because he disagreed with and ridiculed feminists on the internet. And this is why, to answer the second part of the previous question about whether this is all alarmist, no. Because we're living in a society where this crazy feminist orthodoxy has flooded up out of the universities into the judiciary, into the police forces, the executive, into politics, into the media, most obviously and most deeply penetrated in the media. And this is now, now in the West, you can be arrested and put on criminal trial for disagreeing with a feminist on the internet. That is Orwellian, nightmarish stuff. And it's very difficult for me to take seriously the allegation that anything we've been talking about this evening is alarmism.
Unfortunately, we're almost out of time, so this will be the last question. But it's a fashion question for Milo, so I figured he'd enjoy it.
Oh, good.
Well, we'll both be fine.
Are the purple socks a tribute to Prince, or is it just a coincidence?
No, but he lives near here, doesn't he? No. I'm too young to know who he is. I wrote a very disobliging... I wrote a very disobliging column about him once. I said that he doesn't seem very good at the internet. He wants to give his album away. Well, he did give his album away, 2010, on the cover of the Daily Mirror, which is a tabloid in the UK. And he gave his album away in CD form on the cover of a newspaper because he said it would prevent piracy. So I suggested that given that he was getting on in years, that he might shortly be eligible for a Silver Surfer class.